The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the advertisers, owners, or management of Pacific Telestations, LLC. For comments, opinions, and questions, please email Jess Lujan at jessthebuzz@gmail.com. The Buzz with Jess Lujan.
Good evening, Guam. I'm Jess Lujan. Welcome to episode 2 on Guam's self-determination, political self-determination. That is my in-studio guest, of course, from last week, this week as well, Dr. Robert Underwood, former delegate and president of the University of Guam. Dr. Underwood, good evening again. Thank you.
Good evening again.
Doc, last week, of course, a little bit of history. This week, some history of yourself and how you became involved in, again, Guam's quest and the Chamorro identity and its quest for self-determination.
Well, it's kind of hard to sort out. You know, I was raised by parents who I think were very independent-minded, and you know, I lived part of my life in the States as a child. I left Guam when I was 9. I came back when I was 15 to go to JFK. In that time period, my parents...
Tumon Senior High School.
In the beginning, and then JFK, unfortunately. But I think both my mother and my father were kind of not, I wouldn't call them, they were just people who didn't follow whatever everyone else was doing. So whatever it was that we thought about, they wanted to argue about it, and so there were a lot of arguments and conversations, and my father would, you know, like to talk about, you know, Guam identity and Chamorro identity.
So the fruit doesn't fall too far from the tree.
No, and it wasn't like he was, you know, for independence or anything like that. He just got us to think about it in very large terms. And my mother as well. My mother would always, you know, has a story that would always kind of be of interest. Like she would, one time she was challenging this woman who was from the States and saying, how come you're registering to vote? And this is just, my mother wasn't challenging her right to vote. She's just,
why are you doing it?
Provoking it, you know, she goes, why are you registering to vote? She said, well, Mrs. Underwood, you lived in the States for a long time. You could have registered to vote there. She said, yeah, but I didn't. that was the way my mother spoke, and that's the way that, you know, so this notion of doing things for Guam and having a clear identification with Guam, I think was pretty early cemented in my life, and having a kind of a questioning attitude about everything. Now being respectful all along, because, you know, my parents also taught me to work hard and be a good boy and don't break the law and do all those things, you know. So.
Well, this is part as well, because you said part of your life you grew up back in the States, but also the movement of the black movement, you know, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King in the time as well, and the recognition of blacks and again, some like the rights they have now that they didn't have back then. Did that help again?
Well, of course, it was all part of the environment. And the day before I left to come back to Guam in 1963, I was sitting in my house in California watching the March on Washington. And it was live. I saw Martin Luther King on TV. I saw John Lewis on TV, whom I know now as personally. So, it had a big impact. And when I went back to go to college in the late 60s, of course, you had all the movements of the 60s. You had the anti-war, you had the Chicano movement, you had brown power, black power, all the yellow power, you had red power.
Flower power.
Flower power. Everybody was powerful, but apparently not enough. And then when I came back to Guam, I didn't make a direct connection to it, but I did kind of provoke people as to what is our status in terms of our language, what is our status in terms of our culture. So language for me was always key, because no matter what happened, even though I lived a long time in the States as a child, I always had some fluency in Chamorro. So it was really important for me to kind of understand why others who were my age didn't have the same fluency. What the hell were you doing with your time you were here? So that really kind of opened my eyes a lot. So I talked a lot about the status of the Chamorro language, and that kind of moved me into the political status of the people.
Now, when you talk about, now last episode, the first episode, we talked about petitioning the UN. Now, yourself and other Chamorros who were involved in this, and of course you were talked about, again, you're a commie basically. You know, you're not a half-breed. You're not with the norm, right? You went against the norm basically. So what prompted you and the other Chamorros again to petition the United Nations? When most people, of course, at the time, pero United Nations, komunistas tinatawag.
Yeah.
So describe that.
I don't know what the others' motivation, but my motivation was pretty clear. I think it was I finally kind of understood the relationship between remaining on the decolonization list and having a forum from which to argue and articulate a case for Guam and the Chamorro people. So I made that case. I made that leap. You know, there were, and remember, this was at the time of the Cold War when I went to the United Nations. So when I went to the United Nations and I spoke, after I spoke, you know, the delegates from Iraq and other pro-Soviet countries all praised me. Cuba praised me, Iraq praised me, and then
so you label more of a commie then.
Well, you know, and then the guy who criticized me was from Australia, and he had been, and I could see from where we were sitting, I could see that he was busy talking to the U.S. delegation to the UN, and they were not. They were not part of the Committee on Decolonization. U.S. wasn't, and I could see that. But I told people, I said, you know, I'm not going to talk to people from Iraq or the Soviet Union. That's not my purpose. Was pretty focused on Guam. So I went through that. I didn't spend any time talking to anybody. I tried to go see a Broadway show and then go back home to Guam.
That first episode we talked about, of course, political status change prior to a constitution, and you helped lead the fight against not accepting the constitution because we have not decided our political self-determination. Now, we talk about petitioning of course, the UN. Now, you said, of course, nothing has changed since then until now. And so nothing has changed. So do you still think it important again, because we're still now asking? I mean, we've gone to Congress. We'll talk later on in another episode about, you know, what route should we take from this. But do you still think it's important that we still pursue the UN route, the international court route, basically?
Right. Well, it's a forum. See, I never disguise the fact that the ultimate authority resides in Washington, D.C. But there's an international conscience that's associated with the United Nations. And it's always important to point out to our fellow American citizens that the UN Charter is a U.S. treaty. You know, the Article 73 is an obligation that the United States took willingly about to cultivating the political development of Guam. So this is a treaty obligation. It's not something that's just that we made up and that the Committee on Decolonization made up, or the Soviet Union made up, or enemies of the United States made up in the UN. Of course, enemies of the United States will exploit it, but my understanding of it is always that this is a forum. Don't give it up, because you know, why would you, if you're going into a struggle and you have 4 tools available to you, why would you willingly give up one tool? And this is a major tool.
Let's fast forward a little bit from that time to your serving in U.S. Congress. Okay, what efforts do you have again to try to get us again to establish our political destiny? Okay,
so remember that before I went to Congress, the people of Guam had passed the Guam Commonwealth Act, which embodied in that Guam Commonwealth Act, you know, a kind of passing reference to Chamorro self-determination, some kind of self-determination process in the future, as well as mutual consent. So when I saw my obligation in going to Congress was to try to pass that act. And so, you know, I worked at it, and I got the only public hearing on the act in 1997. I had 25 members of the committee there, which is really unheard of, because, you know, but I had spent a lot of time trying to get to that point. But in the end, it failed.
It failed.
And I feel badly about it. And of course, you know, when people, when I wrote about it, I said, you know, look, the politicians failed. These are all the politicians who failed, and I listed my own name in it.
Yeah.
So because, you know, I take some responsibility for the fact that I tried and it didn't work out.
It didn't work. Got to pay some bills, Doc.
Okay.
We'll be right back.